Hello there. I know many of you come here seeking a little calm, a place to rest your mind before drifting off. I understand that need, I really do. So, before we begin, a small request. If you find yourself at ease, perhaps a gesture of support would be welcome. A like, a subscription, if you feel so inclined. Tell me too, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you, right now, in the darkness? Now, get comfortable. Let your shoulders relax, your breathing slow, and let the stillness surround you. It started with a road trip. I know, not exactly the most original way to start a horror story, but that's how it happened. Me, my best friend Liam, and his girlfriend Chloe all crammed into my beat-up Subaru. We were heading to this old cabin in the middle of nowhere that Liam's family had inherited, up in the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city and just unwind. Looking back, I should have known that any plan involving unwinding in the middle of nowhere was doomed to fail. Liam was always the adventurous one, the guy who never turned down a dare or a chance to explore. He'd been talking about this cabin for months, painting it as this rustic paradise, far away from civilization. Chloe, bless her heart, was just along for the ride. She was a city girl through and through, and I could see her apprehension about going deep into the woods. I was somewhere in the middle. Part of me was excited for the change of pace, but another part of me, the part that had seen a few too many horror movies, was feeling a bit uneasy. The drive was long, a blur of winding roads and dense forests. As we headed further into the mountains, the cell service started getting weaker, until it finally just gave up completely. The roads got narrower, the trees grew taller, and there was this constant sense of being watched. It was like we were driving into the heart of something ancient and unknown, and the air was growing heavy with anticipation. We reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It wasn't exactly what Liam had described. It was old, really old. A dilapidated structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a porch that sagged like a tired old man. The windows were dark and empty, like eyes staring into the void, and the surrounding woods seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. There was this eerie stillness in the air, a quiet that was almost oppressive. "Rustic charm," Liam said, trying to sound upbeat, but I could see that even he was a little taken aback by the cabin's appearance. Chloe just shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. "It's very secluded," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just stared at the cabin, feeling a knot tightening in my stomach. It didn't feel like a place that welcomed visitors. It felt like a place that had been waiting for us. We unpacked the car and carried our stuff inside, the floorboards groaning and creaking under our weight. The interior was just as unsettling as the exterior. It was dark, musty, and smelled of mildew and decay. The furniture was old and worn, covered in layers of dust, and the walls were lined with strange, unsettling paintings, mostly landscapes depicting the woods surrounding the cabin, but with odd, distorted details that made them feel off. We settled in, lighting a fire in the old stone fireplace to try and warm up the place. Liam tried to convince us that it was cozy and quaint, but I could tell he was just trying to reassure himself. Chloe was quiet, her gaze fixed on the shadows moving in the corners of the room, and I was just waiting for something to happen. It wasn't a matter of if it was going to happen, it was just a matter of when. That night, we tried to play cards, laughing and talking, trying to ignore the growing unease. We told each other stories, talked about old times, about the future. It was just us, in the middle of nowhere, and I felt this strange sense of intimacy with them, like we were the only people in the world. But every now and then, one of us would fall silent, catching a weird sound from the woods, or noticing something move in the periphery of their vision. And every time, the silence would get a little heavier, a little more unnerving. Then the sounds started. Not loud, jarring sounds, but subtle ones. The creaking of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside the window, the scratching sound, like an animal clawing at the walls. At first, we tried to ignore them, to write them off as just the old house settling, or animals moving in the woods. But then, they started getting closer. The second night was worse. The sounds got louder, more insistent. It was like whatever was out there was testing us, pushing the boundaries of our fear. The whispers started that night. Not words, just murmurs, barely audible, like something trying to talk to us through the trees. It was always there, just at the edge of hearing, and when we tried to focus on it, it would disappear, leaving us feeling even more unsettled. Chloe couldn't sleep. She kept waking up, saying that she had heard someone breathing right next to her bed, and I could see how on edge she was becoming. She looked like she was one bad dream from completely losing it. Liam, though, started getting this strange excitement, like he was intrigued by what was happening, not afraid. He kept trying to rationalize everything, saying that it was just the wind or squirrels or whatever. But I could see the way he kept looking out the windows, staring into the dark woods, and I knew that he was feeling it too. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The whispers keeping me on the edge of consciousness, and every time I almost drifted off, I would wake up with a jump, convinced I had seen something moving in the shadows. The air was thick with a kind of dread, and it felt like the cabin was getting smaller, like the walls were closing in on us. The next day, we tried to go for a hike, hoping that some fresh air would clear our heads. But as soon as we left the cabin, the woods seemed to change. The trees grew taller, the path seemed to twist and turn, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. It was like the woods were actively trying to disorient us, to confuse our sense of direction. We kept seeing things out of the corners of our eyes, shadows moving between the trees, shapes that looked like faces, just for a split second, then gone. Liam kept going, even though Chloe was clearly uncomfortable, pushing forward, saying that he wanted to see the top of the mountain. I just wanted to go back to the cabin, to lock ourselves inside and wait for it to all be over. But we kept following Liam, trudging further into the woods. We reached the summit in the late afternoon, and I have to admit the view was incredible. We could see for miles, the rolling hills and forests stretching out in every direction, and the setting sun painting the sky in these vibrant colors. It was beautiful. And for a brief moment we forgot about the unease, about the whispers, about the shadows in the woods. But that didn't last. As we turned to head back, I noticed something odd. The woods were different. It was like the trees had shifted, like they had moved in a way that wasn't possible. The path we had taken to reach the summit was gone, replaced by a maze of tangled branches and dense undergrowth. We tried to retrace our steps, but it was like the woods themselves were actively preventing us from going back, leading us further and further into the depths of the forest. Liam started getting this strange, unnerving excitement, laughing, trying to sound brave, but with an edge of something else there. Chloe was starting to panic, tears welling up in her eyes, saying that she wanted to go home. I felt the dread creeping in, the knowledge that we were completely lost, and I did my best to keep them calm. As night fell, we were still wandering through the woods. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, and they felt closer. They weren't just in the trees anymore. It felt like they were all around us, coming from the ground, the sky, even from the air itself. The shadows deepened, becoming more solid, and the shapes we saw moving between the trees started taking on a more definite form. They looked like people, but they weren't quite people. They were tall and thin, their faces hidden in the darkness, and they moved with this strange, unnatural grace. They didn't seem to be hostile. They just seemed to be watching us, observing us from the edge of the darkness. They were mimicking our movements, but with a slight lag, like distorted reflections, and that made them all the more unsettling. That night, we found a small hollow, a clearing in the woods that looked different than the rest of the forest. It was almost perfectly circular. The ground was soft and mossy, and there was a strange, heavy silence that hung in the air. It was like the woods themselves were afraid to encroach on this place, giving it a wide berth. We decided to stop there, hoping to get some rest before we continued our search for the trail. We built a small fire, the flames licking at the darkness, and tried to get some sleep. But the whispers were louder, and the shadows were closer. The mimics started to move more boldly, stepping out of the darkness and into the firelight. They were all around us now, forming a circle around the hollow, watching us with their unseen eyes. Liam started getting this almost manic look in his eyes, like he was enjoying the attention. He kept trying to talk to them, saying things like, "Can you hear me?" and "What do you want?" But they didn't respond. They just kept watching. Chloe was completely hysterical, sobbing and shaking, saying that she wanted to go home. She started to talk about how this place was evil, about how something was wrong with it, and how we should just run. But with the mimics closing in, there was nowhere left to run. I tried to keep them both calm, but it was hard. The dread was growing, and I was starting to feel like I was going crazy. It was as if the woods had infiltrated our minds, and we were all slowly succumbing to the darkness. That night, I had a dream. I was back at the cabin, but it was different. It was old, decrepit, and it felt like something was living within the walls. I walked through the house, the floorboards groaning beneath my feet, and I could hear the whispers all around me. I saw myself in the mirror, but it wasn't me. It was the mimic, its face a twisted reflection of my own. The mimic spoke to me in my own voice, saying that I had come too far, that I was already part of this place, and that I could never leave. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of the mimic burned into my mind, and when I looked around the hollow, I knew it wasn't just a dream. The mimics were closer now, almost indistinguishable from us. They were mimicking our movements, our expressions, our very thoughts. It was like they were absorbing us, becoming us, and we were slowly losing ourselves. I could see it in Chloe's eyes. The light was gone, replaced by this blank, empty stare, and she was starting to move with the same subtle lag that the mimics did. Liam was gone. He had completely succumbed to that manic energy. He was laughing and talking with the mimics, like they were old friends, and I felt this crushing sense of despair at the sight of him. The hollow felt different now. It wasn't just a clearing in the woods, it was something else. It was like a mouth, waiting to swallow us whole, and I knew that we had stepped into something far more terrifying than we had ever imagined. The mimics started to do things that weren't quite human. They would bend in ways that shouldn't be possible, their limbs contorting and twisting, like they were puppets made of shadows. They would move through the trees with unnatural speed, appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye, and their whispers were getting clearer, like they were trying to tell us something, but I couldn't understand the words. I started to feel this pull, this almost irresistible urge to join them, to become part of the mimicry. It was like they were offering me a way out, a release from the fear, a chance to escape the growing dread. But I knew that if I gave in, I would lose myself completely. I would become just another echo in this hollow. I tried to resist the pull, to fight back against the darkness that was closing in on me, but it was hard. The whispers were getting into my head. They were telling me that there was no hope, that I was already one of them, that resistance was futile. It was like they were trying to convince me, to persuade me to let go, and every time I resisted, the dread would get deeper, the terror would get stronger. I looked at Chloe, and I could see that she was already gone. Her eyes were blank, her movements were jerky and unnatural, and she was walking towards the mimics with this almost serene look on her face. I reached out to stop her, but she didn't react. She just kept moving as if I wasn't even there. Liam was gone too, completely absorbed by the madness of it all. He was laughing and talking with the mimics, completely oblivious to the danger we were in. I tried to talk to him, to reason with him, but he just looked at me with these empty, vacant eyes, and he just kept walking around, talking to the mimics as if they were his old friends. I was alone now, completely alone, surrounded by the mimics, and the darkness was closing in on me. I knew that I was about to be completely lost. I was about to become another mimic, another echo in this terrifying place, and a cold sense of despair washed over me. That's when I saw it, not in the trees or in the shadows, but in the center of the hollow. A shape, almost invisible, like a ripple in the air, and it felt like I had just noticed it after all this time, and I wasn't sure why I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't just a void, it was something else, something ancient and malevolent, something that was watching us all this time. It was the source of the whispers, the source of the mimics, the source of all the dread that had been building up inside me. It was the thing that had called us to this place, the thing that had been waiting for us all along. The mimics stopped moving, and their whispers died down. They turned towards the shape. Their eyes, although I couldn't see them, seemed to be fixed on it. They began to move towards it, slowly at first, and then faster and faster, until they had become one with the shape, and the hollow was silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I was left alone again, with the knowledge that I was completely alone. The unseen shape was still there, though. It was just beyond my vision now, lurking in the shadows, and I felt it, a dark presence, observing me. I tried to run. I tried to escape the hollow, but my legs were heavy, and my will was gone. The dread had become too strong, and the terror was too intense. I knew that it was useless. I was already lost, and there was nothing left for me to do, except wait. I sat down in the center of the hollow, defeated. I stared into the trees, at the shadows that were slowly getting closer, at the knowledge that nothing was going to save me from this place. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, waiting for the thing to come for me. But it didn't. The stillness grew stronger, and the whispers stopped. The only sound was the beating of my own heart, a slow, steady rhythm in the heavy silence. And I waited, and I waited, and nothing happened. I opened my eyes, and the hollow was the same. The trees were still, the shadows were still, and the shape was still there, looming in the center of the space just beyond my perception. But the mimics were gone. Chloe and Liam were gone, and I was alone again. I don't know how long I was there. It could have been hours, it could have been days, or it could have been weeks. Time had lost its meaning, and the world outside the hollow had ceased to exist. I was just there, in the stillness, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I stood up. I don't know why, I just felt like I needed to move. I started walking, not knowing where I was going, not caring where I was going. I wandered through the woods, past the trees that had seemed so threatening, past the shadows that had seemed so solid, and the path appeared before me, almost as if it was guiding me. I walked back to the cabin, the same old dilapidated structure that I had seen when we had arrived, and I went inside. It was empty. The furniture was still covered in dust, the walls were still lined with those strange paintings, and the fire was long since dead. But it felt different somehow, like the cabin had been cleansed of something, the dark energy that had once filled it gone. I went to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside. The woods were silent. The sun was shining and the air was clear, and the world felt normal again. But I knew that it wasn't, and it never would be again. I walked away from the cabin, away from the woods, and away from the hollow. But I never forgot what had happened there, and I never forgot the stillness in the hollow, and I knew that I would always carry the terror of that place with me. The story ends here. There is no resolution, no easy answers. There is just the knowledge that some places are inherently terrifying, that some horrors can't be explained, and that some things are better left unseen, and that more than anything is the most terrifying thing of all. The letter came on a Tuesday, I think. Yeah, Tuesday. It was one of those days where the junk mail just explodes out of the mailbox, and this one was tucked right in the middle, like it was trying to hide. The address. It was written in this old weird script, like something out of a history book. The return address? Blackwood Estate, unincorporated territory, Maine. Never heard of it. I got this weird shiver even before I opened it. My grandfather, Silas Blackwood, he was a mystery. A total ghost, really. My family talked about him like he was some kind of boogeyman, you know? A cartographer, they said. Whatever that means. He just vanished when I was a kid. Anyway, the letter. It was from this lawyer I'd never heard of, said I'd inherited his estate. Everything. Blackwood Estate, the letter said. And everything in it goes to you. We suggest that you go there right away and take stock of everything. It added something about legal matters, and then this weird part about discretion. That got me. It felt less like legal stuff and more like a threat. I'm a historian, see? I look into obscure stuff, old legends, places no one talks about. So the thought of going to this old estate in the middle of nowhere, figuring out what my grandfather was up to, I was hooked. The drive to Maine was a long one, really long. And as I got further north, things just changed, you know? The suburbs, the stuff I'm used to, just disappeared. It was all dense forests, the trees on either side of the road like these creepy skeletal fingers reaching out, branches all tangled. The air got heavier. That smell of wet dirt and pine was thick in the car. And then, my cell service. Yeah, that just gave up completely right before sunset. Like, boom, gone. I found Blackwood Estate in this valley, like it was hidden away on purpose. This big, gothic-looking manor, like straight out of a horror movie, dark against the sky. Stone walls, ivy creeping up everywhere, windows that just stared out into the gloom. And the silence. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. The front door was this huge chunk of wood, with this brass knocker that looked more like a dead bug than a handle. I hesitated, my stomach feeling tight, before finally knocking. The sound was huge, echoing through the house, just a lonely thump in all that quiet. The door creaked open, really slowly, like it was reluctant to let me in. There was this woman there, in the doorway, face hidden in the shadows. She was tall and thin, her hair pulled back tight. Her eyes, when I saw them, were really pale, like chips of bone. She said she was Mrs. Abernathy, the caretaker. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and it just made me feel wrong, somehow. "Welcome to Blackwood Estate, Mr. Hayes," she said, like she'd been expecting me. Her gaze stayed on me way too long. "Your grandfather left instructions. I'll show you the house and then we can talk." She didn't smile or anything. The inside of the house was even creepier than the outside. It was cold, musty, the air heavy with the smell of old books and something rotting. The furniture was ancient, covered in these dusty sheets, the walls lined with bookshelves that went all the way up to the ceiling. It felt more like a tomb than a home, and every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lamp Mrs. Abernathy lit, made me jump. She took me through this maze of hallways, past all these closed doors that felt like they were whispering stuff, to the study. A big room full of maps, globes, research papers, just covered with them. This, she said, was where my grandfather worked. "Your grandfather was unusual, Mr. Hayes," she said, staring at this map pinned to the wall. It was unlike any map I'd ever seen, a jumbled mess of lines and symbols. He was very particular about his work and his hobbies. I didn't ask about the hobbies. I just looked at the map. It was like something was pulling me into it, a weird vortex of ink and paper. And then I got this wave of nausea, the same metallic smell I'd noticed earlier hitting me hard. "I've got to go now," Mrs. Abernathy said, snapping me out of it. "Dinner will be ready soon. Please, don't go wandering off. Some parts of the house aren't stable." And then she just left, leaving me alone in the silent study with all of my grandfather's creepy maps. Dinner was weird. Mrs. Abernathy served me this bland stew in the dark dining room, moving like a robot, like she was wound up to do it. We barely talked, the silence just making things feel worse. After, I went back to the study, drawn to those maps, those creepy secrets. I spent hours going through the documents, trying to figure out what the symbols meant, what all those strange territories were. It wasn't just regular maps my grandfather was drawing. It was something else, something otherworldly. He had notes about ley lines and the veiled world, stuff I knew from folklore but never took seriously. Surrounded by all his stuff, though, it was starting to feel a little too real. There was this one journal entry where he talked about a whispering stone, a rock he found somewhere out there. He wrote about how it felt alive, vibrating with energy, making his bones buzz. It was the same feeling I'd had in the quarry in that weird dream last night, you know? He said he could hear whispers when he touched it, whispers from another place, telling him stuff no one should hear. My heart was pounding when I realized this was the stone in the letter. The more I read, the weirder the maps got. Some of the places he marked just didn't exist, while others seemed to shift and change on each map, like the ground itself was unstable. There was one place he kept circling, writing the nexus next to it in this frantic, messy handwriting. I tried to find the nexus on my own map, but it was impossible. The location kept shifting, like it was a ghost, a phantom that kept moving just out of reach. It wasn't a map, it was a gateway. My grandfather's hobbies were starting to become a lot clearer. Later, as the wind outside howled like some tortured thing, I found a secret door behind the bookshelf in the study, hidden like it didn't want to be found. I pushed on it, and the wood groaned, revealing these narrow stone stairs leading down into the dark. With just my flashlight and a growing sense of dread, I went down. The air got colder and damper. The only sound was the dripping of water. The stairs led to these underground chambers, dug right into the rock. They were lit by these glowing crystals embedded in the walls, casting these creepy shadows. They were filled with stuff, weird tools, animal bones, talismans that seemed to pulse with energy. In the middle of the biggest chamber was this big stone pedestal with this dark metal thing sitting on top. It was ornate and alien, with these connected rings and glowing symbols. It looked familiar, like a super fancy version of the symbols on the maps, and I felt like I had to touch it. I got closer, drawn in by something I couldn't see, and then the moment my hand was near the device, a voice echoed in the chamber. Deep, booming, old, like it spoke through the air, not through sound. And it spoke in the same language I'd heard in the quarry in my dream. The voice sent me flying back, the hairs on my neck standing up, and it felt wrong, like it didn't like me being there. The crystals started glowing brighter, and the shadows seemed to get deeper. I got this feeling like I wasn't alone, that something else was there with me. I tried to run, but it was like the walls had moved in, trapping me. The voice spoke again, stronger this time, and I felt a pull, this urge to just give in, to become part of this whole thing. It was talking to something deep inside of me, something ancient, something I didn't know I had. It was telling me what was going on. My grandfather wasn't just a cartographer. He was a keeper, guarding the balance between our world and the one beyond the veil. The maps weren't about real places. They were about the paths between these worlds, the routes that had to stay closed. He was called to the estate because there was a rip, a tear in reality, and that device he was using was trying to repair it. He had used the stone to keep something on the other side from crossing over. But now the device was failing, and it was getting stronger. It wasn't just a voice now, it was something you could feel. I tried to clear my head, to fight that pull, but it was like trying to stop a train. My own mind was fighting itself between the urge to run and that desire to join whatever was on the other side. I stumbled back, my hand on the wall, trying to find a way out, when my fingers touched something cold and smooth. Another stone, smaller than the crystals, hidden in the shadows. It felt different. It wasn't humming, but it was vibrating in a way that was almost comforting. I grabbed it and squeezed, and I felt clear, like I could breathe again, and that pressure went away. The voice backed off, the crystals got dimmer, and the air felt lighter. I didn't know why that stone helped, but it was my only chance. I ran through the chambers, the shadows behind me seeming to reach out for me, and burst out into the study. The house was different now. The sheets on the furniture seemed to writhe, shadows were moving on their own. The walls were vibrating with this dark energy. I could hear the whispers from the chambers seeping through the walls. The whole house was alive, writhing with that thing on the other side. I ran out of the study and into the hallway. Mrs. Abernathy was there, her eyes on me, this little smile on her lips. She wasn't just the caretaker, she was something else, something that had been waiting for me to touch the device. "You shouldn't have touched it, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice deeper now, with this dark glee. "The ritual is complete, the veil is thinning, and you, Mr. Hayes, are the key." Mrs. Abernathy moved at me, way too fast, her hands reaching out like claws. I dodged and ran back to the door, that stone still clutched in my hand, praying it would still work. But the door wasn't just a door. It was a gateway now, a mess of darkness and twisted shapes, like reality itself was folding around it. I knew I couldn't go that way. The thing had taken over the house. I turned and ran through the house, the shadows chasing me, Mrs. Abernathy laughing behind me. Every room had changed, warped by the thing's presence. It felt like a living thing, trapping me. I ran from room to room, using the clear moments the stone gave me to stay ahead. I ended up in the library, rows of my grandfather's books all around me. They seemed to shift as I moved, titles changing into weird patterns. And on the shelf I saw it, the book he studied most, a big leather one with the same symbols I'd seen on the maps. I grabbed the book, hoping to find an answer. It was in the same language as the whispers, the symbols rearranging themselves as I looked at them. With the symbols and the pictures, I could understand it. My grandfather wasn't just a cartographer and a keeper. He was the last in a line of guardians keeping this entity back. Whenever there was a rip, they had to find a way to seal it. And the stone, a piece of something bigger, was the only thing that could. I read how to use the device and what it meant for the world. The book said the device didn't just open a gateway, but that it changed the world, shaping reality itself, making it better for those creatures to come through. The device wasn't meant to be opened, it was meant to close the gap. I could use it and fix the tear, or I could just let it all happen. I looked around the library, the shadows getting closer, and knew I didn't have much time. My choice was going to change everything. Mrs. Abernathy was there in the doorway, her eyes glowing. "It's time, Mr. Hayes," she said, now many voices at once. "Help us shape your world?" I looked down at the stone. It was warm now, like a light in the dark. I knew what to do. I turned and ran back to the underground chambers, Mrs. Abernathy and the shadows chasing. But I wasn't scared. I had a purpose, a reason to fight. I got to the pedestal and placed the stone on the device and started chanting the words in the old book. The device started to glow and the entity screamed. The room filled with light and the device started humming, and I focused on that light. It reacted to my touch and the words I spoke, the rings spinning faster until it was just a blur. The dark energy started moving back to the device, and the stone in my hand pulsed with it. I had a choice then. use the device and the stone and maybe lose myself completely, maybe even join the entity or back out. The book didn't say what would happen when the breach was closed, just that it needed to happen. Did I close it? Or did I let the darkness come through? Did I become the new keeper? Or did I get taken by that thing, and now I'm stuck between those worlds? I felt the pull, this need to join the darkness, but I fought it with everything I had, with the strength of those who came before me, and I screamed. The story, like my grandfather's maps, ends without a clear answer. I left the end open to allow the reader to try and think what might have happened. That, I think, is where the true terror lies, in not knowing what is to come and knowing that we have to make a choice. It wasn't a specific event, not at first. It was more of a feeling, a subtle unease that started to creep into the edges of my life. I'm a travel photographer, mostly focusing on small, off-the-beaten-path towns. I'm drawn to places that have a certain quiet charm, a sense of isolation, and that's what drew me to the town of Port Blossom, nestled on the edge of the California coast. It was small, unassuming, with a population of maybe a couple hundred people, mostly fishermen and their families, and a handful of retired folks looking for a quiet life. It was the perfect kind of place for me. It had a certain beauty, a rugged charm that I felt I could capture in my photos. The houses were old, weather-beaten, with these faded colors that spoke of a long history with the ocean. The air was filled with the smell of salt and the sound of seagulls, and the pace of life was slow, deliberate, a welcome change from the chaos of the city. I rented a small cottage on the edge of town, overlooking the ocean. It was cozy, comfortable, with a large window that framed the ocean view, and I settled in, excited to spend a few weeks exploring the town and capturing its essence. The first few days were idyllic. I would wake up early, grab my camera, and walk through the town, taking pictures of the old houses, the fishing boats in the harbor, and the people going about their daily lives. Everyone was friendly, welcoming, happy to share their stories, and I felt like I was finally able to relax. But then, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, like a small skip in the record, a momentary glitch in the rhythm of the town. It started with the tides. They seemed different. They would recede further than usual, revealing these strange, dark patches of sand on the beach, and then they would rush back in, almost as if something had been disturbed. I would see small things moving in the shallows, shapes that looked like fish, but they didn't swim like fish. They would glide along the sand, moving too quickly, and they would disappear when I tried to focus on them. Then, the sounds started to change. The waves would crash on the shore with a hollow sound, as if they were hitting something other than the sand, and the seagulls would screech with a different, almost panicked tone, their cries echoing through the town. The wind would whisper strange words, phrases I couldn't understand, just at the edge of hearing, and the silence that followed was always unnerving. The people of Port Blossom started acting a little different too. They became quieter, more reserved, and their smiles seemed less genuine, their eyes empty. They would greet me with the same friendly gestures, the same polite words, but their expressions felt off, like they were wearing masks. They would repeat phrases or tell the same stories with slight variations, and their movements felt more robotic, more controlled. I tried talking to them about it, asking if they had noticed anything strange, but they would just smile, shaking their heads, saying that it was just my imagination, that I was seeing things. And it started to feel like maybe they were right. Maybe I was just overthinking things, that all these strange occurrences were nothing more than coincidences. But I couldn't shake that feeling that something was deeply, inherently wrong with this town. Something was lurking beneath the surface, just out of sight. The cottage I was staying in started to feel different too. It felt like it was shifting, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The walls would creak and groan in the middle of the night, as if they were being pushed from the outside, and the shadows would stretch and distort in ways that didn't make sense. The floorboards would shift, just slightly when I walked across the room, and the windows would seem to change their size, making the ocean view look different each time I looked at it. I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I had just been pulled from a deep sleep, and I would find myself in a different part of the house, without having any memory of moving. The furniture would be rearranged, the pictures on the wall would be crooked, and the objects on my desk would be in different places. It was like the house was playing with me, toying with my sense of perception and trying to make me lose my grip on reality. I tried to find a pattern, to understand the logic of these changes, but it was impossible. It was like the house was changing at random, as if it was being controlled by something unseen. I tried to map the cottage, taking measurements, drawing diagrams, and taking pictures, but every time I tried to record the changes, the house would shift again, making all my efforts useless. The feeling that I was being watched grew stronger, and it wasn't just from the windows of the house. I started to notice that the pictures I had taken of the town were different. The people in the photographs would be looking at me, their expressions more distorted, and the objects in the background would seem to move, creating these subtle, unnerving changes that I couldn't explain. The ocean in my photos seemed darker, more menacing, and I would see these strange shapes moving in the water, things that didn't belong. It was like the town was invading my perception, blurring the lines between reality and illusion, and making me feel increasingly isolated and alone. The people of Port Blossom, though they were still friendly to me, they seemed to be hiding something, and I could feel it. That sense of something being very, very wrong. I spent hours looking through my photos, trying to find some logical explanation for these strange occurrences. I would zoom in on the images, looking for patterns, and I would start to see these faces lurking in the shadows, behind the people, and in the empty spaces of the buildings. These weren't reflections, or anything as mundane. It was like the town itself was watching me, trying to communicate something through these subtle changes, and the sense of dread was becoming all-consuming. Then the sand started to appear, not on the beach, but in my cottage. Small patches of sand, dark and wet, would appear on the floor, in my bed, on my desk, as if the very substance of the beach was being pulled inside. I would try to sweep them away, to clean the house, but they would reappear as soon as I turned my back. It was like the sand was alive, moving through the house, invading every corner, and I knew that something was very wrong. The changes to the house started to intensify, becoming more drastic, more unsettling. The walls would shift in the middle of the night, creating new rooms, corridors that shouldn't exist, and the furniture would move on its own, sliding across the floor, knocking against the walls. The windows would grow larger, then smaller, changing the ocean view, and the shadows would stretch and distort in a way that I could no longer ignore. The house was becoming something else, something unfamiliar, a place I didn't recognize, and I knew that I was losing my grip on reality. I started to feel different too, like my sense of self was slipping away. My memories would become fuzzy, my thoughts would be disjointed, and my perception of reality would shift erratically. I started forgetting things, names, faces, places, and I started having these strange dreams, these visions of another life, another reality that was just beyond my reach. I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that I was someone else, that I was living in a different time, a different place, and it would take me hours to remember who I was, where I was, and why I was here. My identity was becoming fragmented, like a shattered mirror, and I couldn't hold on to my own sense of self. I started mimicking the people of Port Blossom, repeating their phrases, their stories, their actions. I would find myself walking with their gait, smiling with their vacant expressions, and I knew that I was becoming one of them, a part of this strange, unnerving town. I spent hours staring at myself in the mirror, trying to find some semblance of my old self, but I couldn't. My face looked different, my eyes felt empty, and my smile seemed unnatural. It was like I was wearing a mask, and the person behind it was starting to fade away. The town was changing me, and I was starting to feel like I was losing my own unique identity. I tried to leave the cottage, to escape the changes, but it was impossible. The doors wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't break, and the walls seemed to shift and close in on me whenever I tried to find an exit. The house had become a prison, a cage designed to trap me within its shifting walls, and I knew that I was completely alone. Then, the sand started to move. Not just in small patches, but in large waves, covering the floor, rising up the walls, engulfing the furniture. It was like the house was filling with sand, becoming one with the beach, with the ocean, and the very substance of the town was infiltrating every part of my reality. The sand was dark, damp, and cold, and it felt like it was pulling me down, dragging me deeper into its depths. I tried to fight it, to resist the changes, but it was useless. The sand was everywhere, and it was consuming me, and I was starting to feel like I was losing control. I was no longer the observer, no longer the photographer. I was just a part of the town now, another piece of the puzzle, another echo in the chorus, and the lines between myself, the house, and the sand were starting to disappear. I started to feel like the sand, like the house, like this whole place. I was starting to feel like everything and nothing at all, completely lost in a reality that wasn't my own. The house had transformed completely into a labyrinth of shifting sand, a series of interconnected chambers and passageways where the walls would rise and fall, the floors would drop away, and the doors would lead to nowhere. The sand was everywhere, covering the walls, the floors, the furniture, and it felt cold, heavy, like it was alive. I could hear it moving, whispering to me, and every now and then I would see small things shifting, moving, just below the surface. I spent what felt like days, maybe weeks, wandering through the house, trying to find my way out, but it was impossible. The sand would shift and change, creating new pathways, and I would always end up back where I had started. The house had become a trap, a maze designed to disorient me, to confuse me, and to erase any sense of identity I had left. The sounds intensified, the whispers grew louder, and the objects in the house seemed to move on their own, taking on these distorted shapes, as if they were mocking me. I would see the faces of the people of Port Blossom in the sand, their expressions more distorted, their eyes more empty, and I felt like they were watching me, always watching, from within the walls, from within the floors, from within the sand. Then the water started to appear. Not the ocean water, but something different, something darker, colder, something that felt ancient and unknown. Small puddles of water would appear on the floor. Then those puddles would grow, filling up the house, and the water would move with a strange energy, swirling around the walls, rising up to the ceiling. I could hear the waves crashing in the house now, not from outside, but from within, the sound reverberating through the walls, and the sand would swirl and twist as it mixed with the water, becoming a dark, viscous fluid that felt like it was pulling me down. I tried to escape the water, to reach higher ground, but it was useless. It was everywhere, and it was rising, and I was slowly being submerged by it, and with it the sense of my own self began to erode. I felt like I was being dragged into the depths, pulled into the very fabric of the house, becoming a part of the shifting sands and the endless ocean that was both inside and outside. The fear was all-consuming, and I knew that I was completely lost. Then I started to see them, not faces in the sand, not the people of Port Blossom, but something else, something that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. They were in the water, swimming through the sand, their bodies long and thin, their skin pale and translucent, their eyes black and empty. They were mimicking the movements of the water, the shifting of the sand. and the whispers of the wind. They were the source of everything, the controllers of the house, and the reason for this horrifying transformation. They weren't human, or at least they no longer were. They had been changed, altered by this place, by the sand, by the water, and they had become something else, something alien, something terrifying. They were like the echoes of the sea, the remnants of another reality, and they were watching me, waiting for me to become one of them. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the terror, accepting my fate. I felt the water rising, covering my face, filling my lungs, and I was no longer afraid. I was beyond fear. I was just part of everything. I felt the sand consuming me, dragging me into the depths, and I was no longer separate from the house, from the town, from the sea. Then I felt it. Something different, not terror, but a strange sense of calm, a feeling of release, like I was finally home. The water began to recede, the sand began to settle, and the house transformed again, becoming something new, something peaceful. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. It felt like seconds. It felt like an eternity, and all of it just flowed together. I opened my eyes, and I wasn't in the house anymore. I was on the beach, the sun was shining, and the waves were crashing on the shore with a steady rhythm. The seagulls were flying overhead, their cries clear and sharp, and the wind was whispering words that sounded almost welcoming. I was on the sand, on the edge of the water, and the air felt clean. I don't know how or why I was suddenly out of the house. I didn't remember escaping, I just remember being there. I looked back at the town, at the houses that were all the same, weather-beaten, faded colors, and they felt different, like they weren't real anymore. The people of Port Blossom, who were now walking on the beach, their faces looked different too. They weren't smiling, but they weren't empty either. They were just there, going about their lives, and they seemed to be at peace. I looked down at my hands. They felt different. And then, I looked up at the sky, and for a moment I wasn't sure who I was, or what I was. But then, I looked back at the water, and there, just below the surface, I saw them. The beings that had been watching me all this time, and they were staring at me, not with malice, but with something that looked almost like recognition. They weren't hostile, they weren't trying to pull me back, they were just there. And for a moment, I understood everything. I understood the town, the house, the sand, the water, and the beings that lived within it. It was all one, connected by the currents, by the tides, by the whispers of the wind. I turned and walked away. I walked away from the town, and I walked away from the ocean. I left my camera behind, I left everything behind, and I walked towards an unknown future. The story ends here. I did not give you a clear resolution. It's a little open-ended. You can choose whether to see it as an escape or a complete breakdown. I left the ending open, inviting the reader to contemplate the nature of reality, the fragility of self, and the unsettling possibility that what we see is not all there is. The true horror, in my opinion, lies in the unseen, the unknown, and the constant fear that what lies beneath the surface might be far more terrifying than what we can perceive, and that the world around us is not as stable or as fixed as we might believe. And as always, you make the choice. Did they escape? Or did they simply become a new part of the endless cycle? My grandmother always said that the quietest places are the ones that hold the most secrets. She was a bit of a strange one, but she was also right about a lot of things. I thought about that a lot when I received the invitation. It was plain, cream-colored cardstock with only a few words written in elegant, spidery script. The Echo Garden welcomes you. Come find yourself. No return address, no signature, just those words. It landed in my mailbox like it had always been meant to be there. I'm a botanist by trade, not a glamorous one by any means. I work for a small university, and study the effects of pollution on rare and endangered plant species. But beneath the lab coats and research papers, there's always been that fascination with the strange and the unusual. That's why the invitation piqued my interest. It was so vague, yet so specific. The Echo Garden? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to find it. The online searches went nowhere, no mention of an Echo Garden. It was as if the place simply didn't exist, which just added to the intrigue. I dug through old maps, scoured local folklore, spent hours down rabbit holes on the internet, and finally, I found something. A small note in an old botanical journal describing a location in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a place where rare plants were said to grow in abundance, a place some locals called the Whisper Woods. They also mentioned that people who went there were never quite the same again. That got me. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I had to see it for myself. I packed my gear, grabbed my camera, and headed south, my grandmother's words about quiet places echoing in my mind. It was a long drive, the familiar landscape of my home state fading into the rolling hills and dense forests of North Carolina. As I got closer, it felt like the temperature dropped a few degrees. There was this quiet, heavy air that settled over everything, and my phone service started getting spotty. Then, it just went dead. I found the trailhead at the end of a dirt road, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Private property, keep out." But I wasn't about to turn around now. I followed the path into the woods, the trees getting thicker, the sunlight struggling to break through the canopy above. It was unnaturally silent, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. After a few hours of hiking, I found it. The Echo Garden. It wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't a manicured garden or even a wild overgrowth of plants. It was a circular clearing, surrounded by towering trees, where a collection of plants grew unlike any I'd ever seen before. They seemed off. The flowers were too bright, the leaves too vibrant, the shapes of the plants subtly strange, like they were imitating other things in the forest, but not quite perfectly. There were twisted vines that mimicked the branches of the trees, flowers that resembled the faces of animals, and leaves that looked uncannily like the feathers of birds. They moved too, not quite as if it was the wind, but like they had their own rhythm. I cautiously stepped into the clearing. It felt different, like I had entered a different world. The air was thick and heavy. The scent of the flowers was overwhelming, like sweet honey mixed with something metallic. As I moved through the garden, I noticed something else, something that sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if the garden itself was mimicking me. Every step I took, a patch of moss or a group of ferns would ripple, moving to my exact footsteps. When I raised my arm to take a picture, a nearby branch mimicked the same movement, reaching upward. I took out my notebook to jot down some observations, and a nearby leaf began to twist itself into the shape of the pencil I was holding. It was like a living mirror, a reflection of everything I was doing. And that, more than anything, made me feel really uneasy. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, trying to understand what was going on. The more time I spent there, the more unsettling things became. It felt as if I was losing my sense of self, that I was becoming one with the garden, one of the mimics. The plants followed my movements with increasing precision. Their mimicry grew more refined. It was as if I was losing control of the environment, and the environment was learning from me. I tried to leave, to head back to the trail, but I found that I couldn't. The path had disappeared. The trees seemed to have shifted, closing the path I had used to get into the garden. I walked in circles, trying to find a way out, but every path I took led me back to the center of the clearing. It was like the garden was toying with me, a living maze that shifted with my every move. I could feel a creeping sense of dread. The quiet places had always had secrets, I knew, but I could feel that these were not secrets I should know. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I noticed something else. It wasn't just the plants that were mimicking me. I began to see other things, shapes in the shadows, shifting forms that resembled people, but slightly off, like distorted reflections. They were mimicking me, but subtly, their movements just a split second behind my own, their expressions echoing my own, but exaggerated, twisted. One of them, in the corner of my vision, took a step to the left just after I did, mimicking the turn of my head. I pulled out my camera, hoping to capture what I was seeing, but when I looked at the pictures, there was nothing there, just the plants, the trees, and me. I started to feel like I was going crazy. It was as if the mimics were only visible to me, as if they existed only on the periphery of my perception. I tried to sleep that night, wrapped in my sleeping bag, but it was impossible. The garden felt like it was alive around me. I kept hearing whispers, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs, as the mimics moved through the shadows. Every rustle was like a reminder that I was not alone. When I woke up, the garden was different. The plants were more vibrant than before, their mimicry more precise. They weren't just imitating me, they were imitating each other. The flowers that looked like faces seemed to be talking to each other. The vines that mimicked tree branches seemed to be moving as if they were dancing, and those feather-like leaves appeared to be preening themselves, like birds. The whole garden felt like it had become a warped, living mirror, reflecting all the different aspects of the forest. I walked through the garden, trying to understand it, trying to figure out what it all meant. I touched a leaf and felt this strange sense of clarity. I felt like I was being given an understanding of how this place was created. It was as if the garden was showing me, not through words, but through feelings, through that strange metallic hum. The garden, I understood, wasn't just mimicking the plants and creatures of the forest. It was mimicking the memories of those who had come before. It was a living echo chamber, absorbing and reflecting the emotions, the thoughts, the very identities of those who entered its embrace. And I, it seemed, was next. I began to feel strange, not just unsettled or afraid. It was like I was changing. My memories started to feel fuzzy, as if they were not quite mine, as if I was remembering the lives of others. I would find myself thinking in ways that weren't my own, imagining things that were not part of my life. I started to forget simple things, the names of my friends, the location of my home, my phone number. I spent hours trying to remember, writing down lists on the few pieces of paper I had left, my handwriting changing, almost unrecognizable. I looked at my reflection in the dew on a flower, and I didn't see myself. The features were mine, but they were different, as if I was seeing someone else's face, like a mask that had been placed upon my own. The eyes were hollow, the mouth drawn into a forced smile, the skin pale and thin. The mimics had started to copy not only my movements but my thoughts, my memories, my very personality. They would walk with my gait, speak with my tone, mimic my mannerisms, all with a subtle distortion that made them just wrong. I watched them, my doppelgangers, and I couldn't help but wonder when I'd turned into this, when the garden had decided that I would be its next specimen. One day, I found myself mimicking the mimics. I would move a few seconds after they moved, mimicking their imitations of me. I started to see the world in fragments, in echoes, like the world around me was just a series of reflections, an unending hallway of mirrors. I felt myself losing the core of who I was, my sense of individuality dissolving into the collective consciousness of the garden. I couldn't even remember why I came to this place, the reason, the research, the desire for the unusual. It was all gone, swallowed up by the garden. I was no longer a botanist, no longer an explorer. I was just a mimic, one of many, lost in the echo of my own identity. I stumbled through the garden, trying to find something to hold on to, something to anchor me to my own reality, when I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a small, unassuming flower that wasn't mimicking anything. It had a simple white bloom with a delicate yellow center. It was the only plant in the entire garden that wasn't trying to be something else. I reached out and touched it, and it gave me another burst of clarity. It whispered to me, not through sound, but through feeling, telling me I wasn't completely lost. The flower told me, or rather reminded me of the invitation. Come find yourself. The garden, I realized, wasn't trying to steal my identity. It was trying to help me uncover it. All these different aspects of my being, all the echoes and mimics, it was all there to help me understand myself. The garden was trying to show me my true nature. But to do that, I realized, I would have to embrace the changes. I would have to lose myself to find myself, to become part of the mimicry, to be one with the garden, before I could truly understand what it was trying to show me. I stopped fighting the changes, the feeling that I was losing my sense of self. I let the garden absorb me. I walked among the mimics, no longer trying to distinguish them from myself. I saw myself in their distorted reflections, and I found myself embracing them. I watched the mimics moving, their imitations of me becoming more refined, their expressions taking on new subtleties. I began to understand that each one of them represented a different aspect of me, a different part of my personality that I had never fully acknowledged. There were mimics that mirrored my fears, my insecurities, my darkest thoughts, my greatest hopes. And in each of those reflections, I found something that was essential to my identity. I spoke to the mimics, using the fragmented thoughts and memories that were still accessible to me, and they responded, echoing my words with subtle variations. It was as if they were having a conversation with my soul, a debate about who I truly was. I spent what felt like days, or maybe weeks, moving through the garden, observing the mimics, feeling the constant changes taking place within me. I started to see not only myself in the mirrors, but I was also able to see what the others before me had been like, their thoughts and their fears. I could feel their longing for who they once were. As I embraced the changes, I began to feel more at peace. I wasn't afraid of losing myself because I realized that I was finding myself in the process. The garden wasn't trying to take me over. It was trying to show me who I was. One night, under the glow of the moon, I found myself in the center of the clearing. The mimics surrounded me, their distorted reflections shimmering in the moonlight. They held out their hands, reaching for me, inviting me to join them. I reached back, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in a long time. As my hands touched theirs, I felt a surge of energy, a merging of identities, and I became one with them. I was no longer just myself. I was a part of the echo, a thread in the fabric of the garden. It wasn't a loss, not really. It was more like an expansion, an opening up of all the possibilities of what I could be. The lines between myself and the garden blurred. I wasn't a visitor anymore. I was an inhabitant. Time lost its meaning, and the boundaries of self dissolved completely. I was all the mimics, I was all the plants, I was all the emotions, the fears, the hopes that the garden had ever absorbed. I was everything and nothing. I was the echo of myself. But even in that state of being, there was a flicker of something else. The memory of the world beyond the garden, the memory of my old life, the memory of my grandmother's words. I found myself wondering about the outside world, the life I had left behind, the family I might have, the friends I didn't remember. And that was when I heard it, a whisper. Not from the garden, but from somewhere else. A voice that sounded familiar, yet distant, calling my name. It was a voice from my old life, a voice that reminded me that there was a world beyond this echo. I realized that even though I had embraced the garden, a part of me still longed for something else, something more. I looked around at my reflections, all the different pieces of me that had become part of the garden, and I knew, deep inside, that I had a choice to make. Would I remain in this state of oneness, forever part of the echo, or would I try to return to my old life, to reclaim my individuality, even though that meant leaving a part of myself behind. The story ends here, at the precipice of that choice. The question remains unanswered, lingering in the air like the whispers of the echo garden. Was it ever really an invitation, or was it a test? Was the purpose of the garden to understand the self, or to lose it completely? That is up to you to decide. It started subtly, like a flicker in the periphery of my vision, a momentary skip in the rhythm of the everyday. I work as a software developer, mostly on debugging and maintenance for this massive, interconnected operating system that basically runs the entire city. I'm used to glitches, minor errors in the code, the kind of thing you fix with a few lines of code and a quick reboot. But this was different. It wasn't a system error, not exactly. It was like the world itself was glitching. It would happen for a split second. The traffic lights blinking in a sequence that didn't make sense. The faces of people I passed looking slightly off, like they were just a copy of someone else, or the same song suddenly playing on everyone's headphones on the street. Just a momentary blip, then everything would go back to normal. At first I thought it was just me. Stress, a lack of sleep. I brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But then, it started happening more frequently, and the glitches were getting stranger. The same person, wearing the same clothes, would cross my path multiple times in a single day, as if they were on a loop. The conversations I overheard felt oddly repetitive, phrases echoing from one person to the next, like they were following a script. The weather would change erratically, a bright sunny sky turning to rain in a matter of seconds, and then just as quickly back to sunshine again. It was like reality itself was stuttering, playing back little snippets of the day out of order. It wasn't just me noticing it either. I started to see it on other people's faces, a look of confusion, a quick glance around, as if they had caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong. I tried talking to some of my friends about it. They brushed it off, said I was overworking, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe they were right, but I knew I wasn't hallucinating this. I could feel it, that sense of something being deeply wrong. I started keeping a journal, trying to document each glitch as it happened. I would write down the time, the location, a description of what I had seen, trying to find a pattern, some sort of logical explanation for these anomalies. But the more I documented, the more I realized that there was no logic to it, no pattern. It was random, chaotic, and increasingly unsettling. The city, which had always felt so familiar, so predictable, was starting to feel alien. I started avoiding crowded places, taking detours on my way to work, just to try and escape those moments of glitching. I spent more time in my apartment, shutting out the city, trying to find solace in the familiar. Then the glitches started happening there too. The hands on my clock would jump forward and backward, the lights would flicker, and the TV would suddenly show this static, like something trying to communicate from the other side. The walls of my apartment, which I thought were the last bastion of stability in this crazy city, started feeling wrong, like they weren't solid, like they were shifting, just subtly, almost imperceptibly. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I couldn't trust my own perceptions, my own memories. I couldn't tell what was real and what was not. The world had become a distorted reflection, a glitching mirror image of itself, and I knew, with a growing sense of dread, that I was trapped in it. The day that everything changed started like any other day. I woke up, ate my breakfast, got dressed, and headed to work. I walked out the door, and something was different. The street was too quiet. There was nobody around, no cars, no pedestrians, no ambient city sounds. It was like the entire city had gone to sleep. I looked around and I could see the faint outline of the buildings, the shape of the streets, but they were blurry, like they were not quite in focus. I tried to call my friends, but there was no signal. I tried to access the internet on my phone, but the connection kept dropping. and the pages were filled with random characters and glitches. I felt this surge of panic, like the walls were closing in on me, and I started to run. I ran through the deserted streets, the silence growing heavier, the air thicker, as if it was a living thing. I ran and ran and ran, trying to find someone, something, anything that could make sense of what was going on. But the city remained empty, the streets deserted, the buildings silent, and I knew I was alone. Then I reached a corner, and I saw it. Or rather, I saw him. A man, standing there, perfectly still, his face blurred as if he had been smudged by an eraser. He was wearing the same clothes, the same posture, the same blank expression that I had seen before. It was like he was a character from the game, stuck in the same animation loop, endlessly repeating the same action. I turned around and ran in the opposite direction, desperately trying to escape that feeling of recognition, but it was no use. Every corner I turned, he was there, standing perfectly still, always in the same position, always with the same blank expression. It was like the city was trying to trap me, to keep me from going anywhere, to keep me in this endless loop. I started to realize that it wasn't just the man, it was everything. The buildings were all the same, copied and pasted in a never-ending cycle. The streets were the same, with subtle changes that were almost indistinguishable. The traffic lights blinking in the same sequence, the same garbage cans on the same corners. It was like the entire city had been reduced to a series of repeating patterns, an infinite loop that I was trapped within. I spent what felt like days, maybe even weeks, wandering through the city, trying to find a way out. Every attempt to escape was futile. Every path I took led me back to the same streets, the same buildings, the same repeating characters. The sun always seemed to be setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the city, and the air was always filled with that oppressive silence. I tried to talk to the other characters, but they didn't respond. They would just stare at me, their faces frozen in a vacant expression, their bodies moving along predetermined paths. It was like they weren't people at all, just a series of programmed responses, repeating the same actions over and over. I was completely alone, and it was starting to feel like I was completely lost. My memories were blurring, the distinction between past and present was fading, and I couldn't remember who I was before I had come to this place. The only thing that was clear was that I was stuck in a loop, in a reality that wasn't my own, and there was no way out. Then, the glitches began to change. They weren't just random now. They were becoming more deliberate, more controlled. It was like something was learning, adapting to my attempts to escape, and the loops started to get stranger, more distorted. The streets would suddenly twist and turn, the buildings would shift and rearrange themselves, and the characters I passed would suddenly change their expressions, looking at me, recognizing me, with this look of malicious awareness. I started to feel like I was being watched, not just by the characters in the city, but by something else, something unseen, something that was manipulating the world around me. It felt like I was a character in a game, and someone was watching me, manipulating my reality for their own amusement. I tried to resist this feeling, but it was hard. The sense of being controlled was getting stronger, and the dread was becoming unbearable. It felt like I was losing my grip on my free will, like I was becoming just another puppet in this twisted reality. Then, I started to see him, a figure, almost transparent, moving through the city, always at the edge of my vision. He seemed to be observing me, analyzing me, and he would disappear when I tried to focus on him. It was like he was the source of the glitches, the one who was manipulating the world around me, and the feeling of being controlled grew more intense. I tried to talk to him, to get his attention, but he just ignored me, continuing his path through the city, his presence becoming more imposing, his control more absolute. I realized that he was the overseer, the one who was in charge of this twisted reality, the one who had me trapped in this endless loop. I started to feel this urge, a desperate need to confront the overseer, to break free from his control, to reclaim my own agency. I knew that it was a dangerous idea, that it would likely lead to something far worse, but I couldn't bear the feeling of being a puppet, of having my reality manipulated by another. I started to deviate from the path, to break the rules, to try and escape his control. I would take detours, try to enter buildings that had been locked, and do anything to escape that feeling of being trapped in the loop. Every time I did, the glitches would become more intense, the city would twist and turn, and the characters around me would react, their expressions becoming more menacing. But I kept going, driven by this desperate need to regain my sense of self. The overseer started to notice me. He would appear more frequently, watching me, his presence growing more intense, and I knew that I was playing a dangerous game, that he wasn't going to let me break free without a fight. The city started to change again, transforming into a maze, a labyrinth of twisting streets and dead ends. The buildings stretched into the sky, their windows like countless eyes watching me. The streets would suddenly shift, leading me back to where I had started, and the characters around me would whisper my name, their voices echoing in the empty spaces. It was like the overseer was playing with me now, testing me, pushing me to my limits, and I could feel the sense of dread getting deeper, the terror becoming unbearable. I would find myself back where I started, and the city would change again, becoming even more twisted, more terrifying. I tried to map the city, to understand the rules of the labyrinth, but it was impossible. It was like the patterns were constantly shifting, changing with each step I took, and I couldn't find any sense of direction, any sense of purpose. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. The boundaries between reality and illusion were blurring, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I was just a character in the labyrinth, a puppet being manipulated by the overseer, and my hope for escape was diminishing every minute. The overseer would appear more often now, watching me, and he wasn't silent anymore. He would whisper, calling my name, and the sound echoed in the empty spaces of the labyrinth. He would tell me that it was pointless, that I could never escape, and that the only option left for me was to embrace the control, to become part of his world. I would find myself in these strange, distorted rooms, the walls lined with mirrors, reflecting an infinite series of my own image, and in each reflection, I would see the overseer, his presence growing more powerful, his control more complete. It was like he was trying to absorb me, to erase my individuality, and make me a part of himself. I kept resisting, but it was getting harder. The more time I spent in the labyrinth, the more I felt like my identity was being chipped away, like I was becoming just another echo of the overseer. The dread was becoming all-consuming, and I was starting to lose hope of ever breaking free. Then, in the depths of the labyrinth, I found it. Not a way out, but a hidden room, a space that was different from the rest of the city. It was empty, almost completely bare, with just a single chair in the middle, and the walls were lined with code, intricate patterns of numbers and symbols, and a feeling that everything in the labyrinth was a carefully crafted illusion. I sat down in the chair, feeling a strange sense of calm, as if I was finally safe. I stared at the code on the walls, trying to understand it, trying to find a pattern that would help me escape. I felt the dread fading slightly, but I knew that it wasn't over yet, that I had just entered the final stage of this game. The overseer appeared then, his presence filling the room. He wasn't transparent anymore. He was solid, real, and his face was clear, a twisted reflection of my own, his eyes glowing with power. He sat down opposite me, mirroring my movements, and we stared at each other for a long time, the silence hanging heavy in the air. He smiled then, a cold, menacing smile, and he spoke, his voice a distorted echo of my own. "You have come so far," he said. "You have resisted me for a long time, and now you have reached your final choice." He told me that he had created this city, this labyrinth, for his own amusement, and that my resistance had made things more interesting. But now the game had to end. He gave me a choice. I could choose to join him, to become a part of his control, to be forever lost in the city, or I could choose to let it all go, to release myself from this reality and face the unknown consequences. I sat there staring at him, and I realized that there was no easy way out, that both choices were equally terrifying. If I joined him, I would lose my individuality, my free will, and I would become just another echo in his twisted world. But if I let it go, I would face the unknown, and that could be even worse than the labyrinth. I had a feeling, though, that his labyrinth was becoming unstable, that the cracks in the fabric of reality were growing, and that the choice was not about control or freedom, but about whether I would finally break the cycle. I looked around the room, at the intricate code, at my twisted reflection, and I knew that I could not become part of this. I chose to let it go. I closed my eyes and waited for the end. The story ends here. There is no grand escape, no ultimate victory, no resolution, just the choice, the acceptance, and the stillness. Whether the character was released from the loop, or whether they were swallowed by the nothingness of the unknown, is left to the reader's imagination. The true horror is not knowing, the constant dread of the inescapable, and the chilling realization that we might all be trapped in a reality that isn't our own. And that's what I hope you found here.